And since it's 80 years of Superman, we're celebrating having the Man of Steel here on planet Earth. It's very fitting that we speak about not only Superman character itself, but how Superman was created and how we got involved into Superman and the mythos behind him. Kavora, what was your first exposure to Superman?
First, I just want to note that, 80 years is older than we are.
Yes.
So I believe my first memories of Superman would be watching Super Friends cartoon on Saturday morning. So, of course, there was, all the superheroes, back then there was like Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, and the Justice League. But Superman was always the biggest and the most powerful. I mean, he was definitely a standout on that show.
Yeah, that was more than likely that was my introduction to Superman as well. Because around that time, I was getting the Mego dolls, World's Greatest Superhero Mego dolls, and then watching the cartoons. So they tend to be synonymous with each other, my early memories of Superman. And like you said, 80 years, it's older than us. I remember my grandfather talking about Superman. So it's multi-generational. Everyone had their definitive version of Superman.
There used to be like the old George Reeves show that was in black and white. I mean, originally in black and white and then later in color. I remember watching that on TV, and even then, I mean, as a child, I thought it was great. I loved it, and reading the Superman comics. My older brother had lots of Superman comics, and the World. It was called World's Finest, that had a lot of Superman issues, and just the basic Superman comics with Lois Lane and the villains, Lex Luthor, a lot of the classic villains that were around back then.
Brainiac.
Yes, Brainiac.
Metallo.
And who else? Mr. Mxyzptlk. Lots of the villains. It was great. It was great fun, and Superman could be. They made him campy sometimes, or even more serious sometimes. They showed his vulnerabilities. Being in love with Lois was one thing, and like there were the villains that knew sometimes how to embarrass him. They made other stories like that, and they showed that he was actually a man with feelings. I mean, he was, of course, a man of steel, physically powerful, but also he had emotions, so he was someone that we could relate to on some level. That's one of the reasons he has endured for so long.
Yeah, he has endured for quite a while, and he's often referred to as the original superhero. We have to give credit to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they were high school buddies starting in 1932 in Cleveland, Ohio. They loved pulp fiction magazines, comics, movies. Our preview episode of StarPodLog, we talked about how important magazines were, early magazines and fanzines. And actually, they had self-published fanzines that they were involved in called Science Fiction, the Advance Guard of Future Civilization. And that's where they first had the title of a story, The Reign of the Supermen. So we can see early on that this idea of super or men of great power were in their heads. But within time, they scaled it down to not just Supermen, but Superman. Made their own Ash Can Edition comic books. It's DC Comics, or at that time, National Publications. They were looking for something new, something exciting, and guess what happened? Superman Action Comics #1 came out, and the world got the first glimpse of Superman. And you said that you had some of the Superman comics, but even as much as the comics were very much part of the Superman mythos, in order to get it to the public, the average person didn't read comics. That was considered something for kids. So within time, the radio program came out. Did you ever hear any of the radio programs that were on?
No, I didn't. What were those like?
Well, I had some cassette tapes of them, and they never had supervillains. It was very much like the Superman TV show of George Reeves. They didn't have any supervillains. He just fought robbers and things of that sort. But for the 1930s and 40s, that was something that was enjoyable to people.
Oh, so it was like the 30s and 40s radio shows, and they actually put those on cassettes later for people to buy.
Yes.
Very nostalgic, and yes, something like where you can enjoy something that was made a few years ago and think, well, wow, this is another hero.
Yeah, it's when you think about it, there are very few superheroes that have been around for every generation that long, because when it did, there were some serials as well in the movie theaters about Superman, but the big mainstream Superman that most people of the 1950s 50s were familiar with was the George Reeves TV show, The Adventures of Superman. And then once the 70s rolled around, our generation, truly believed that a man could fly.
1978 is when Superman the movie came out with Christopher Reeve, and that's, of course, the most popular Superman movie so far.
And that's definitely our Superman was Christopher Reeves.
He did a great job as Superman. He could embody the handsomeness and the strength of the man, and even do the more meek Clark Kent. He could do everything. He could show the power and the meekness of Clark Kent.
Everything about that movie I absolutely loved, and I even enjoyed it more so Superman 2, because that's when we got to see General Zod and his partners take over Metropolis.
Superman 2 was excellent with the three villains, and also carrying on the relationship between Superman and Lois Lane. The movie had action and romance. It was a beautiful story. Even the end in the beginning of it with the Phantom Zone, and that was such a very unique visual effect for the time.
It was. It's amazing. I don't recall any other movies being filmed back to back, but they actually made Superman the movie and then Superman 2 back to back, so you could see that they're very consistent with each other.
Yes, I think they had to do that because they had some other thing to go to. They just had to wrap up the movies very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I remember the Superpowers figures were coming out in the 80s, so that featured Superman. There was always Superman merchandise. The movies continued on with Superman 3 with Richard Pryor, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. They started making more animated features as time went on. I mean, when you think about it, and how many different versions of the comic books came out, there's never been a time without Superman since Superman started 80 years ago. It never really went into a lull.
That's right. The comic books have always been around. I mean, the movie, and of course the movies too, making them every few years or so, and getting the movies rebooted every few years. And the comic books have always been there, and maybe the comic books, the sales they've had their slow periods, but they always picked back up. They were always able to revamp the comics and restart them and make great new stories.
And you followed all the different variations of Superman that were on television in the 90s, 2000s, and up to today, isn't that right?
Yes, there was Lois and Clark that had. That one was more about the romance between Superman or Clark Kent and Lois Lane, and there was a show that was on Saturdays called Superboy, which I really enjoyed. It was more, it was made for younger audiences, but it really had good stories. And then later there was Smallville, which was about Clark Kent as a teenager and showing his evolution, and even Lex Luthor as a teenager showing his evolution to becoming evil. And that show was great, and it lasted so long. It was on 10 years. It was amazing.
And we've been consistently going to Superman Celebration that happens every year in Metropolis, Illinois. We got a chance to meet quite a few of the celebrities.
Yes, we did. And there's the current show Krypton that's on now, which is sort of like a Superman prequel. It takes place on Krypton and has Kal-El's grandfather as the main character. And there were some actors there that were at Superman Celebration.
So what are some of your fondest memories of Superman that you could relate to?
I remember seeing Superman 2 in theaters, and at the time it was just like the best movie I had ever seen. Being a little girl, seeing the Superman in flight, being able to cheer for him, and all the battle scenes at the end, they were so long, but they were really good. And you get to cheer for Superman as you go along. Yeah, and the way Ursa and Zod were so mean, and you're like boo and everything. It was just a great experience. And I saw that movie several times too, and it was always just as good every time I saw it.
There's so many classic lines out of that movie that are iconic.
Kneel before Zod. That's the best one.
And it was in our last rewatch of it, we rewatched it a couple months back, the entire series. You do pick up things along the way that you don't realize, and one of them was, my entire life I thought that Zod landed in Houston, Texas. And then we found out that it wasn't Texas, that it was Iowa. Houston, Iowa that he landed in, which makes more sense because if you look at where he lands in a very small town, not in a major metropolitan area.
It was very strange. What was funny was Zod not really knowing. I mean, he thought the planet was called Houston.
Mm-hmm. And so that was one of my favorite Superman memories too. Everything around that era of the early 80s I thought was especially exciting. The superpower toys I enjoyed, the Mego dolls. So Superman has been around for a while, and then we love all aspects of Superman. That was one of the last comics he just bought last week before we went to DragonCon was another Superman comic.
Yes, it was.
Now, some of our fans on Facebook related their comments about their fond memories of Superman over the years. Starting out with Lee Drew from Birmingham, Alabama. He fondly remembers watching George Reeves on I Love Lucy and the interaction that he had with the going in costume with the Superman character and Lucille Ball. Remember that one, Kavora?
Yes, that was hilarious. And George Reeves did a great job because he could interact with Lucille Ball. He did the comedic acting very well, while still staying in character as Superman.
That was always worth rewatching.
And next we have Martin Delaney from Glasgow, Scotland. Wow. He remembers watching the Filmation Superman cartoons in black and white.
So that goes back to the 60s and 70s, so he has some history with Superman. And next we have John O'Shaughnessy from Geneva, Illinois. He enjoyed watching the George Reeves TV show, and he also noticed that in those episodes that Superman only saved Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane.
Yeah, that was funny too, and the fact that the villains were all bank robbers or people like that.
Mm-hmm.
No supervillains. And next we have Jerry Rice from Cabbagetown, Georgia, and he remembers an issue of the Superman comics where Superman loses his powers and is in a wheelchair, and Jimmy Olsen tosses him $1,000 in this What If issue.
I could see why Jerry would remember that. That was an odd one.
It was. I mean, can you imagine Superman in a wheelchair? Almost the way Christopher Reeve wound up in a wheelchair.
Yeah, that was horrible. I remember hearing that happen, and everyone said, how could Superman be in a wheelchair like that? That was a tragedy.
It was. Very sad.
Next we have Trent Voorhees from Athens, Georgia. She fondly remembers opening up a shed full of Superman comics in the early 70s and the musty smell of them.
Yes, you always get that smell when you've had them in storage for a long time. Next we have John Peck from East Haven, Connecticut. He enjoyed the Warner Brothers animated series and also creepy Brad Wilson from Superman 3.
Who wants to remember Superman 3?
Yeah, not the best of the Superman movies, but he's right that Brad Wilson was very creepy in that movie.
And David Harrington from Norwalk, UK, remembers Superman's car lift. So I assume that was from there's two ways we could look at this, Superman's car lift. One would be the cover of Action Comics #1, and that's where Superman's lifting a car. But I think, since we keep referring back to the movies, what about the little boy Superman that lifted the car?
Yes, it could be that. As a little boy, and he already had his super strength where he could lift the car.
Remember we got a chance to meet the actor that played that little boy at Superman Celebration?
Yes, it was fun seeing him, and he's much older now, but yes, we did get to see him at a con. And next we have Matt Hill from Milton, West Virginia, and he also enjoyed the Christopher Reeve movies. Those were such iconic movies. Everybody thinks of those movies when they think of Superman.
Yeah, in this retrospective of 80 years of Superman, we see that the multimedia has made a major effect on people. Not only the comics, that was a springboard for the character, but there were video games, massive merchandising campaigns, but the cartoons and the movies really struck a chord with everyone.
Yes, that, and there were several TV shows with Superman. Lois and Clark, Smallville, Superboy, and everything, all the incarnations have still come up over the years. I mean, he's just a very enduring character.
It is true. So let's take a brief break. We'll get back to focusing in on the Superman comics. Now, in this segment of the comic scene, not only is it going to be myself and Kavora, but we have a special guest, and he's going to be a reoccurring special guest. This is my best friend, the best man of my wedding, and also the main man, because that is his call sign. He is the comic book main man. Introduce yourself, main man.
Hi, my name is Main Man. I'm a Nashville native. I started reading comics when I was around 4 years old. I have an extensive background in reading primarily DC and Marvel. I've collected comics essentially since, well, I was 4 years old. So that's been roughly 40 years.
And I have photo proof of us going through your comic collection, and it is a plethora of decades.
Many decades. 4 decades. Yeah, 4 decades. So I have a pretty sound foundation / knowledge of what's going on in both DC and Marvel.
Okay, how'd you get into comic books?
I'm really not 100% sure how I got into comics because that was such a long time ago. I just was always drawn to the stories, mostly character-driven. I'm not really art. I was never really focused on the art, but if it had a great plot and the characters were strong enough, then I was typically drawn to it.
It was kind of funny how we met. We've been working together for years at our jobs, and then I made a mention about Alec Holland, and that perked your ears up.
I mean, who doesn't know who the Swamp Thing is? I mean,
that's what impressed me. Is like you knew who Alec Holland was.
If you follow DC at all, or if at least you've seen the 1982 movie, you know immediately who Alec Holland is. So it was no mystery to someone who actually reads comics or has read a comic.
Well, from that point forward, we started hanging out together, talking about comics, became best friends.
It's true. And when he said, "My name is Clark Kent," for some reason I knew that was Superman. I didn't. I had absolutely no idea until then. I mean, that was such a mysterious name you chose.
No, we were talking about some deep stuff. Remember, we were talking about Miracle Man too, and I was impressed that you knew who Miracle Man was. That's why I knew you were a real comic nerd.
I did. I had Miracle Man 1 through 16. I mean, you can't really beat an Alan Moore written comic. I mean, quite graphic. It was definitely something that was new to the times. Well, I mean, Alan Moore at that time was just extraordinary anyway, because he had V for Vendetta. He had obviously something somebody's heard of called Watchmen, and he also did Swamp Thing at that time too.
All right, DC or Marvel?
Marvel of the 80s and 90s for sure. DC now, but Marvel at that time, that was pretty pivotal. I mean, you can actually see how. You can actually see their effect now. I mean, it's essentially which movies do better, DC or the Marvel movies? Well, unquestionably, it's the Marvel movies because they developed such a rich, history and foundation with the characters that, I mean, that's why they're successful now. Because pretty much anybody that's like 22 through 50, they immediately can relate to the Marvel characters.
Yeah, they're more consistent.
They're definitely, in the movies, they're definitely better written.
When it came to superheroes, I preferred the Marvel side, but when it came to the darker or abstract stories that later became Vertigo, such as Swamp Thing, Animal Man, Sandman, 100%, I love the DC titles.
And he liked Crypto the dog, too.
Now, Kavora, you were primarily a DC fan and definitely a Superman fan. What did you find exciting about the Man of Steel miniseries that was released in 1986 that was a reimagining or a reboot by John Byrne?
They made him the sole survivor of Krypton, because before we knew that there was Supergirl and there was Crypto the Superdog, but here we have Superman as the only survivor. Superman, of course, as a baby, Kal-El, when he was sent to Earth, he was actually sent as a fetus instead of as a baby in this story, so that they could say when he landed on Earth in the ship, he came out of the womb, so they could say that he was actually born on Earth. So they wanted to make him like an Earth native instead of actually saying that he was. But he always thought of Earth as his home, though, because this is the only planet he's known. This is where he grew up.
I mean, it was definitely a retelling or a revamping of the Superman mythos, because that was right after Crisis of Infinite Earths. You know, they were pretty much trying to reimagine Superman and reboot it, obviously for sales purposes, but also just a different take on it. I mean, it's kind of like pre-Ultimate Universe of what the Marvels did in the 2000s versus, they're trying to make it more relatable to a younger generation. And also, it started getting ridiculous too, because Superman could travel through time. He could move planets.
He was unstoppable without a piece of rock
or magic. Because he also had an extreme vulnerability to magic. But I mean, how many magical characters were there at the time? Zatanna, who said everything backwards. How cheesy was that?
So what was your first experience with the Man of Steel miniseries? Do you remember where you bought it from?
I did. I bought it here in Nashville at this place called Great Escape.
And they're still in business now, and we still buy comics from them.
Yeah, they're kicking.
What was it like getting it on the rack when it first came? Because I didn't. My brother bought more of the DC comic. I bought more of the Marvel comics, so I would read his. And I thought that was, for me, that was an excellent introduction or revamping of Superman, because it was right after the Crisis. It was the perfect time to jump into the DC characters. So it was reaching out to someone who was looking for a fresh start. But you having a strong background in DC, I know, Kavora, you said you loved the series. How about you, Main Man? What was your initial reaction when you read them?
Well, definitely it's an iconic cover more than anything. And it was a pretty interesting miniseries. I mean, essentially, instead of having it, I thought it was more of like a cold, sterile approach to Superman more than anything, because instead of Superman actually being born, through something humanoid, Superman was actually born in like a gestation chamber from Krypton, which was a little different too. They definitely depowered him a lot. It was just when he finally met Batman, that was kind of interesting also. But it was they didn't stop there, because Wonder Woman also, they revamped Wonder Woman also. George Perez, I remember he did the art. I can still remember the cover.
Yes.
And they did the same thing with Batman as well with Year One.
Yes.
So, I mean, DC was just basically like turning the page. They were just starting a new chapter.
What do you think about the side characters and villains? Kavora, you mentioned how you enjoyed the revamp of Lex Luthor.
Lex Luthor was reimagined as a millionaire villain instead of the old mad scientist who wore the tight pants and everything. And, of course, he wasn't bald in this. He was very different. He was more of a businessman tycoon, and this was in the 80s. It was in the days of J.R. Ewing and Alexis Carrington. He fit the idea of the rich bad guy.
And that was a common theme of the 80s. It seemed as though businessmen were becoming celebrities on themselves just for amassing power. It was very commonplace in the media.
It was, and so it just made Lex Luthor fit right in, and he was this evil bad guy who considered himself the owner of Metropolis, and he was jealous of Superman's popularity. The way they changed his relationship with Batman was a good one too. They made him, less friendly with Batman. They still had the mutual respect, but they have such different personalities. So they have different ways of being crime fighters and the different ways of getting the bad guys. And they were a little bit more antagonistic in this one. Because they had different feelings about things. Batman was more the brooding type, and Superman was more the happy, hopeful type. But it was a good contrast. I think it worked because it fit their characters very well.
Yeah, they definitely Lex Luthor. They made him more relatable. He wasn't the cheesy guy wearing the purple shirt and the green pants. He definitely he had an approach as a businessman. You really didn't understand his motivation for hating Superman, other than the fact that he felt like his ego was threatened because he wasn't the number one guy in Metropolis anymore. It definitely set the grounds for the ongoing series that started after that as well.
What did you think about having John Byrne involved? Because John Byrne's history before that was heavy on the Marvel side. We were familiar with his work on X-Men and Fantastic Four. How do you feel about getting John Byrne having full reins with that project?
Well, at the time, you really couldn't beat it either, because John Byrne was one of the hottest names in comics at that time. Because, yeah, he did Fantastic Four, he did X-Men, he also kickstarted Alpha Flight, so he was definitely one of the hottest writers at the time. So I just think it was something to where they put the talent where they needed to. He did a fantastic job. I mean, here more than anything it's the characters and the plot, but it's the art that separates John Byrne more than anything. Because I remember everything being very bright.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And well drawn. I mean, I think almost anybody can resonate with John Byrne art, especially with the X-Men when he wrote with Chris Claremont.
That is true. I usually view that as the definitive origin story for Superman. Up until this day, even though there's the New 52 and there's so many rebirths and revamps of DC characters, you have to keep updating story. It somehow.
Unlike Batman, Batman's pretty much cut and simple, cut and dry. Mm-hmm. There was a gunshot in the alley. Parents died. He became very fanatical after that, and then it's just in the story, and then they just kind of layer it from that point on. Superman is kind of like, well, now it's especially with the right before Doomsday Clock, it's like, oh, did Jor-El actually didn't really die? that he actually was plucked out of time by Dr. Manhattan. It's just he's just one of those characters where, I mean, Superman obviously is the most recognizable comic book character there ever was.
Yeah, it's true.
And so it's just one of those things where, because of that, they're always going to take liberty, or some writer is always like chomping at the bit at being able to tell his version of his origin.
Now, during that time period, I remember there was a frenzy for getting those comics. They actually offered 2 different covers, a direct edition cover with Superman pulling just the chest shot, and then the newsstand edition, where's the full figure of Superman. There was a lot of media buzz just because there were even 2 different covers. Did you end up buying both?
I didn't. I just had the one where he's pulling his shirt apart.
Yeah, that's my favorite out of the 2 as well.
I think that it's worth having. That having the trade paperback is worth having, and it's definitely worth reading once. Do I think that it's something that stands through the test of time? I mean, yeah, absolutely. If you're into Crisis of Infinite Earths, then you definitely want to see what happens next. I mean, I definitely 100% agree with that.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.